All right, open book quiz. Page 461 if you like. We've already read it this morning, but I know that you may want to double check your notes. Page 461, chapter 21, verse 22. All right, anybody know what this topic is? This is the abortion paragraph. That is to say, this is a paragraph that is used as part of the underlying understanding of the issues around the topic of abortion, although it in itself is not talking about an intentional abortion. So let me walk you through what the Torah is saying here, and then we're going to talk about some of the implications, not just for the personal life of people who are going through difficult choices, but also within the broader society. So page 461, chapter 21, verse 22 is where it starts. Got to keep all those numbers straight. There's a reason I didn't become an accountant. But I do know the Torah. And in the Torah, we start off with a scenario, as the Torah normally does. That is to say, the Torah will usually describe an incident and then describe a ruling about that incident, just about as often as the Torah will tell us simply, don't do something. So we might have a don't murder line, but we'll also have, if your neighbor's ox attacks your ox, this is what you can do. Two different varieties of how to give instruction. And in this particular variety, it is the example. So we have two guys that are fighting. They shouldn't be doing that. We already know that there are many problems when people are fighting and that someone is going to have to pay for the damages that happen to each other. Personal injury has been a thing for a long time, not merely the purview of daytime commercials. So, these two men are fighting, and in the midst of the scuffle, they hurt a pregnant woman. And she miscarries. That is to say, she loses the child. But, says the Torah, no additional tragedy, damage, there's a couple different ways to translate the word ason, no other tragedy occurs. In that case, there is a monetary fine that is levied against the attacker that caused this miscarriage to happen. But if there was a greater tragedy, then it is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc., etc. Now, just a quick reminder, for those of you who haven't heard, we never blinded people or knocked out teeth. This is a idiomatic expression in biblical Hebrew of saying it is proportional, meaning that if I knock out your tooth, you don't get to have me executed for the grave injustice of knocking out your tooth. And likewise, if I blind you, I don't pay a penalty that is a pittance, as if all I did was give you a little bit of a tooth chip. I have to pay you a penalty that is proportional to the damage done. So, if there is a miscarriage, there is a simple monetary fine. If the woman is injured in some greater way, meaning she dies or she is injured in some additional way, then we follow the normal rules of our tort system. That is to say, personal injury damages apply as usual. All right. Everybody with me on this? I know that the example can be a little confusing because we've got three people involved, but hopefully you've kept up to speed. And if not, now's the time to ask questions, or during Kiddush, that works too, but you'll miss a lot of the rest of the conversation if you're not up to speed. Okay, so, what does this have to do with abortion? Well, because from this paragraph, we deduce something extremely important, which is that while the fetus is still within the mother, the fetus is not considered to be a person. If it were a person, then if the fetus were miscarried and lost its life, then the penalty would be life for a life. Because you caused the death of a person, you will be executed. This portion of the Torah in particular is rather replete with telling us that it is life for a life. And while that may sound harsh in many other circumstances, we have to understand this was there to ensure that someone couldn't buy their way out of having murdered someone else, that they could not escape the punishment from their crime simply because they were rich enough to pay off whatever penalty the government had placed upon them. No, if you murder someone, it doesn't matter how much gold you have, you are going to be executed, just as if you were broke. something we could all look forward to, having fair and equal justice regardless of bank accounts. But that's an aside. On this particular topic, we see that the person who caused the miscarriage is not executed. The person who caused the miscarriage is not executed, which means the personhood of the fetus was not established. Yes, it is alive, but it is treated in the same manner as other aspects of the woman's body with regards to personal injury. Yes, it is considered an injury that the fetus has been miscarried, but it is not considered to be murder. Everyone with me? Good, because that's really important when you get to certain circumstances. For example, if the fetus is growing in a way that is jeopardizing the mother's health, what is the Jewish rule? What's that? Save the mother. Is that a suggestion? No. It is an obligation. It is a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah to terminate the pregnancy and save the mother. Why? Because the mother is a person and the fetus is not. How do we know? We just read it. Therefore, if we have something that is not a person and something or someone that is a person, and we have to make a choice between the two of them, the choice is very simple in Judaism, and in fact, it is no choice at all. We save the life of the mother. Now, according to Judaism, then, when does the fetus transfer from being a part of the mother to being an actual separate person? When it is born, right? When it exits the womb. When it exits the womb. Exactly how much breathing is a little bit more temperamental to determine, but certainly once it has left the womb, it is considered to be a person on its own, which is why you can end up with the ultimate tragic situation where a woman is in the midst of giving birth, the baby has been partially given birth, and then there is stuck, and in the ancient world there was little they could do. And you were then really in a problem because the baby was now considered a person, the mother was always a person, and you can't save one at the expense of the other. God forbid we should ever go back to a time when we had those types of maternal problems. We should continue to press forward with our science in order to make sure that every pregnancy, birth, and delivery is all done as healthily as possible. Still work to be done there, but you do not want to go back to the Dark Ages. All right. So now many of you might have already known many of the outlines of what I've just shared. But the implications of 2122 here go a lot further than that. Because if personhood does not begin at conception, but personhood begins at the actual delivery, then that means there are other things that are permissible within Jewish law. For example, birth control. Many forms of birth control, such as an IUD or such as the pill, which is many varieties of birth control, are predicated on the idea of preventing the implantation of a fertilized egg. That even if the egg is fertilized, it will not be able to implant and begin the gestation process. Well, according to Judaism, since that fertilized egg is not a person, that is perfectly fine. Right? There is no tragedy that is occurring in the lines of the text that we have just been talking about. And thus, within Jewish law, an IUD or the birth control pills are considered perfectly fine, and indeed, in some cases, are strongly encouraged, usually for the health of the mother, but also sometimes for the economic well-being of a family that is in danger of having a runaway process of birth that they would not necessarily be able to handle as well as they would like. Judaism supports and indeed sometimes encourages proper and responsible use of birth control methods such as this because we do not consider that fetus to be a person yet. You're all with me so far, right? Okay. Yes?
I believe that's not a person until it's separated from the mother and breathing on its own.
It's a little bit, the gray area is a little bit grayer than that. When the head and most of the body have been delivered, it is considered under Jewish law to be a separate person. Even if much of the baby is still inside the birth process. That is a very fine line, absolutely. Usually that doesn't come up because once the head is out, a lot of the hard part is done, and usually the rest will follow. But technically, if I'm going to be extremely precise, and the Torah wants us to be, there is that 1 in a billion chance of the baby being partially delivered and then stuck beyond the aid of our antiquated medicine in the ancient world, but definitely not beyond the aid of medicine in the modern world. So in the modern times, this is very unlikely to come up unless you're in some very strange hypothetical. Now, so far, hopefully, nothing terribly shocking or new. If there is, again, talk to me during Kiddush or make an appointment. We can go over this in more detail. But I'd like to point out a third implication of the Torah's understanding of where personhood begins, which is fertility treatment. In the ancient world, infertility was considered to be a huge problem. After all, with the stressors under which they lived, the diet that they had to sometimes forego because of problems within their farming or other situations, infertility was a very common problem. In fact, we know it was so common because all of the matriarchs struggled with infertility. And this means that when we live in the modern world with its blessings of in vitro fertilization and other even newer techniques, we have a blessing for so many families that wish to have children. But the question becomes, are they already people once the egg and the sperm have been mixed? If so, is it allowed to mix all of these genetic materials, even though only 1 or 2 might be implanted within the gestational mother and then carried to full term? What do you think the answer would be according to Jewish law so far? No problem. No problem, right? Because mixing up those embryos in a laboratory setting is perfectly fine, and you are allowed to handle the remaining fertilized embryos however is deemed appropriate according to local health regulations and other types of rules. But as far as Judaism is concerned, the additional eggs or sperm that were gathered, even the embryos that might have been generated, even if they are viable, are not considered people. And thus they can be handled in a respectful, but not as you would handle an actual person. This, of course, means that fertility treatments are possible under Judaism, because were we to put a limitation of personhood from conception within this mix, well, then those fertility treatments would become impossible, because they are built, at least as far as the science currently exists, around generating multiple embryos and then selecting the most viable for implantation. If we were to be unable to do that, to generate the multiple needed for ensuring that the fertility treatment would work, we would not have this type of fertility treatment. In Israel, in fact, the fertility treatment is a very advanced science and going well, and of course has the full support of all of the Jewish groups within Israel as being commensurate with what we understand about personhood and about the non-personhood of an embryo. Everybody's with me so far, right? Okay, because now I get to annoy you, right? Because it's very important. It's very important to understand that as much as Judaism will give us things that we think feel right, will teach us about the nature of personhood, will put us in a position to understand what to do in very difficult circumstances, will allow us to have proper control of our bodies in ways that I think intuitively make sense for many of us. Sometimes our intuition will go wrong, and the Torah will say, and we have to be prepared for that as well. So let's continue our hypothetical fertility treatment. So we have the fertility treatment, and a Jewish woman and a Jewish man have contributed their genetic makeup, the egg and the sperm, and it has been mixed together, and a viable embryo has been generated, and that embryo is then implanted in a gestational mother, in a surrogate mother. And that person will then carry that embryo to delivery, And once the child has been born, what is its status? Is that child Jewish or not Jewish?
Depends on whether the surrogate mother was Jewish.
Depends upon the surrogate mother's status. If the surrogate mother is Jewish as well, then the status is as the mother, and when that embryo is born, that child is considered Jewish. And if the surrogate mother is not Jewish, even though the genetic material came from two Jewish people, that child is not considered to be Jewish. Because otherwise, we would have had to have claimed that the personhood identity of the fetus began when they were being mixed together in the laboratory, and that the fetus has been Jewish this whole time, but Jewish is an attribute that attaches to a person, not to a thing. And thus, Jewish law has continued to say the fetus is according to the status of the actual mother that delivers it. Yes, we can still call the fetus the children of those who donated the genetic material, but ultimately it is part of the it follows the status of the physical womb from which it exited. Like I said, not everybody is so happy about that one. But let me flip it around and maybe this will make you happier. Imagine a Jewish couple, man and woman, are having trouble conceiving. And it turns out that neither of them is genetically capable of creating the necessary healthy sperm and egg. But the woman still is perfectly capable of carrying a child to term. It's just she can't produce an egg that will be viable. If an egg and a sperm are sourced from donors that are not Jewish or anonymous, and then combined and create a new fetus that is viable and implanted within the Jewish mother, the fetus will contain no genetic material from either of them. And yet, when that baby is born from that Jewish womb, what is the status of the child? Jewish, right? It's not always the answer we want. And indeed, for many people, this causes them great consternation. Obviously, for people out there that are eugenicists that wish to talk about the genetics more than anything, and unfortunately, even among Jews, we have some such voices that believe that there is something uniquely spiritual about Jewish DNA, which is nonsense, but there are some. And for others that are more kind-hearted, that don't wish to have to take a child born from their genetics to the mikveh, that feel that somehow that delegitimizes the child as their child, as opposed to simply affirming the child as being fully within the Jewish faith. There are people who feel wronged by this. And this is something that around this topic of our good friend 2122 is something that we must be aware of. There are a lot of feelings about children. There are a lot of feelings about men and women, about birth and pregnancy. There are so much of our emotions wrapped up within these topics. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. These are topics that should call to the core part of who we are, that should ask us to question and wonder and be amazed at who we are and the life that we generate and the life from which we have come. But we still have an obligation to turn to the Torah, to turn to our scholars, to turn to our understanding, not just of biology, but of how we have lived for 3,000 years in order to navigate the rocky rapids that can sometimes appear.
But does the Torah or the rabbis have anything to say on the case here in Malaysia, a couple were implanted with the wrong fertilized egg, and they know it's wrong because the child is raised in chaos?
So I'm not familiar with all the details of the case. I'll restate it for everybody if you couldn't hear. A case recently in Orlando where during a fertility treatment, a couple were implanted by a different egg than the one they were expecting. And they know genetically that this is not the egg that they were expecting. that by its characteristics, it was not at all from the sources that were imagined. I don't know which sources they were expecting, but whether they were providing some part or none, but in any case, it's not what they had agreed upon. Well, according to Jewish law, when that baby is born, it is still their baby. Right? Because it is not down to the genetics, it is down to, does it come from the womb? And if the answer is yes, it's yours. However, according to Jewish law from other passages, they would absolutely have the right to litigate against the company that had made the error. While the child is definitely theirs, the error of the company that was practicing the fertilization technique needs to be held accountable. And I would also argue, according to Jewish law, they would need to be investigated by the state for possible mishandling of human genetic material, which is a very serious problem. But the child status would still unambiguously be theirs. Yes?
In these complicated situations, what goes on to the birth certificate?
Well, that is a state question. Right? In Judaism, we don't care. Right? Whatever the state wants to write on a birth certificate, that's up to them. And different states, and there are 50 of them, each have their own rules regarding how things will be listed and what the rights or non-rights of the gestational mother versus the biological mother versus the biological father or versus a sperm donor. All of those will have different statuses depending upon each state. It's one of the really fun parts of our federal system that allows each state to decide many of these issues, and each one continues to handle it as they seem fit. And I do not know the Florida particulars of that, but I do know under Jewish law how it would be handled, which is what we've been talking about. I am not a lawyer and I can't answer for American law, but I am a rabbi, which means I can speak to the Jewish implications. But if you are curious, look up Florida law and see exactly how these different circumstances would be rendered within the public record as opposed to our spiritual record. So these conversations are hard, like I said, because our feelings are often very, very passionate in these different issues. But these conversations need to be had. Just like the conversation that was had about what happened in a tragic situation of two people fighting and the inadvertent miscarriage that occurs. That must have been a hard conversation for them to have as well. But the conversation is necessary because we are not, each of us, allowed to decide what we think personally is right. This is something we understand collectively, communally. And as a Jewish community, we also have to defend our right to continue to practice Judaism as Torah and our sages and our tradition has given us. And when there are those who say that we are no longer allowed to perform an abortion where we believe it is mandated, or even where we believe it is permitted, we have to protest and say our faith tells us that this is what it means to be a person. And you do not have the right to tell me otherwise, any more than you have the right to tell me when I should celebrate Shabbat or what name of God I should use in my prayers. Likewise, when it comes to birth control and fertilization techniques, all that is permitted by Judaism must be protected to ensure that we can continue to live in all of the glory that God has given us within these most intimate of moments, according to our Jewish teachings. And there are many voices that would like to take some of those freedoms away from us, that would like to pretend that their interpretation, often of this very same passage, should be implemented as law in contradiction of our understanding of the passage, and in the process would prohibit us from living our life Jewishly. It may not always feel sometimes that in these topics that we are fighting for our faith, but we absolutely are. And we must ensure that we take it seriously enough that the Torah chose to share this idea with us, seriously enough that there have been pages and pages written throughout our history, as seriously enough as we know this impacts so many lives on a daily basis. And we must make sure that those lives can be led according to Torah. Shabbat Shalom.